There's a moment when winter stops being weather and turns into a presence. It doesn't warn, it doesn't strike. It simply falls over the village like a living shadow that squeezes the air until it cracks. At 72 degrees Celsius, the darkness isn't the absence of light, it's a weight dropping from the sky, slipping through every gap, a silence so dense it feels like it's watching everything. The Vikings called it Fimbulvetr, the winter that doesn't end, the one that snaps wood like bones and makes even what you believed indestructible turn fragile. In that cold, every longhouse stops, being a shelter, and becomes a tense organism built from damp turf, swollen beams, and trapped smoke. Where the fire doesn't warm, it holds on. And holding on means every human breath counts, every body adds a fraction of heat, and any mistake, an open door, a misplaced ember, a bad seal in the wall can let in the invisible enemy waiting outside with unbearable patience. Inside, the vapor from their bodies rises to the ceiling and forms a low cloud that works like a shield. Outside, the 20-hour night moves the wind like a knife that doesn't cut but steals life. In that fragile balance, the whole village learns to exist inside winter, not against it, because cold isn't beaten with force but with coordination, vigilance, and habit. And if this frozen world intrigues you, keep watching. What comes next isn't warmer, but it's far more revealing. At that temperature, the air stops being an invisible ally and becomes a blade slipping down your throat like frozen glass. Breathing is no longer an automatic act, but a discipline learned through pain. The Vikings knew this better than anyone. One careless move, one breath drawn too deeply, and the ice could seal the weak lungs from the inside, turning a simple gesture into a sentence. That's why they covered their mouths with damp hide to warm the air before it touched the chest, a rudimentary barrier that decided who lived to see another dawn. Inside the longhouse, every exhale floats like a low cloud clinging to the ceiling. No one looks at it, but everyone depends on it, because that shared vapor keeps just enough humidity for skin not to crack and for the throat not to burn as if swallowing metal. The smoke mixed with soot and fat creates a dark seal that traps the heat and turns darkness into refuge. Every breath adds a fraction of life to the common air. Every mistake takes something away from the group. Outside, the wind whistles as if sharpening its own teeth. Inside, the clan breathes slowly, in order, aware that in a winter like this, even the air can betray. And if this fragile balance surprises you, wait. The next thing winter tries to steal isn't breath, it's food. Cold, as brutal as it is, always finds some kind of limit. Hunger, on the other hand, knows no truce and wakes even when the body can't go any further. In the dead of winter, when the sea freezes like an iron slab and the game migrates south, leaving behind an unsettling silence, the Vikings turn to what they prepared during the months of light choices buried underground that now weigh more than any weapon. Beneath the floor of the longhouses, in pits covered with turf and sealed with layers of wet clay, rest the barrels that decide who survives the season and who becomes a story. Inside them, fish ferments slowly, meat sleeps submerged in its own fat, and grains breathe through a thin veil of controlled mold. A word that didn't exist then, but a practice they mastered without knowing. They were brushing up against modern chemistry. The smell is harsh, almost unbearable, a mix of death and life that hits the nose like a warning. But here comes the twist almost no one imagines. The stronger the smell, the safer the food, because it means the fermentation has run its course, and what would disgust a modern palate has turned into perfect fuel to endure the winter. When water turns to ice, they melt snow with red-hot stones and mix it with sour milk, creating an acidic drink that hydrates even if no one enjoys it. Children chew hard roots, elders sip bone broth, and the porting asses examlient. The entire village understands that eating isn't pleasure, it's victory. And here comes a question that always divides those who hear these stories. Would you be able to taste something like this if your life depended on it? If you dare, leave it in the comments. Your answer might say more about you than about winter itself. In a Viking longhouse, the fire isn't seen, it's sensed, because what governs the place isn't the flame but the smoke, a thick, bluish cloud hanging from the rafters like a living ceiling that everyone hates and needs at the same time. There's no chimney, no vent, because letting the smoke escape would mean letting the heat escape, and in a winter of 72 degrees Celsius, even opening the door at the wrong moment could mean death slipping in like a silent thief. What's surprising, and what no modern manual explains, is that the Vikings lived with levels of smoke and
I'm
CO2
glad you're
that
here to
today
help
an
me with
inspector
this.
would label
It's a
dangerous.
lot of work for
But
one
that dark
person.
air was their perfect
Of
insulation.
course.
It sealed the cracks, warmed the room, repelled insects, and dried the meat hanging from the beams, creating a sort of thermal capsule that turned the entire house into a slow-breathing organism. Archaeologists at Borg and Borg found beams coated with layers of
We're
fat
almost
and
out of
soot built
supplies.
up over generations.
We'll be fine.
A strategy no $20,000 HVAC system can replicate, because as unbelievable as it sounds, a Viking house without a chimney held heat better than many modern homes. When the power goes out, that's the twist no one expects. The smoke that would be poison to us was a shield to them. The women controlled that cloud as if ruling an invisible kingdom. Too low and it suffocated, too high and the heat died. In that fragile balance, the home survived. At first it's just a murmur, a distant vibration that could be mistaken for ice cracking. But within minutes it turns into a roar that cuts through the beams as if the mountain itself were breathing in fury. That's how the Vikings announced the arrival of the Snorstormer, the white storm that doesn't fall but pushes, that doesn't blow but rams forward with sharp ice needles capable of stripping the hide off a moving reindeer. Inside the longhouse, the beams creak like tired bones, and every crack in the wall becomes a threat no one can ignore. Outside, the world vanishes beneath a white wall that has no up or down, only a constant force searching for a weak point, a loose board, an imperfect seal. The clan moves without words, because in a moment like this, speaking is a luxury. They nail planks, press damp cloth into the gaps, smear fat along the joints, and check again and again that the fire is alive, because if the flame dies, there is no coming back. For the Vikings, this storm wasn't weather, it was judgment. They knew only those who listened without fear survived. The children cover their ears so they don't hear the roar trying to force its way in. The elders whisper old songs to mark the rhythm of the waiting, and inside the house becomes a dark womb where the smoke bends under the pressure of the wind.
The winter spirit
Because on a
will be
night like
pleased
this,
with our work.
you don't fight the storm, you fight time. When the storm finally dies and the wind stops striking the walls like a furious animal, the calm everyone expects doesn't arrive. Instead comes a silence so sharp it feels like it splits the air in two. That's when the thing the Vikings fear most begins. Because under the snow, where no eye can see, something starts to move slow, deep, relentless. Ice is never still, never. At 72 degrees Celsius, the earth breathes like a living body, expanding and contracting in uneven pulses that travel through the ground as if a giant beneath were turning in its sleep. Each one of those movements produces a sound that freezes the blood. A dry, low, splintered crack, identical to the sound of a bone breaking. An echo that travels through the beams, climbs the posts, and makes even the smoke-blackened ceiling tremble. The Vikings know that language better than any other culture of the North. They know a superficial crack can multiply in seconds, move under the house, and open a mast, fissure where the heat they spent weeks building will escape. To prevent it, they perform an almost choreographed ritual. Men and women cover the foundations with damp hides, stack alternating layers of mud and dry grass, and compact the turf with short, calculated strikes, as if trying to trick the ice into believing the house is an extension of the earth itself. That's the twist that always surprises those who study these villages. While modern architecture suffers when the ground fractures, the Vikings designed houses that breathe with the terrain, that yield just enough not to break, and that fool the cold in a way no current structure can replicate without technology. And do you think a modern house could survive on ground that breathes like a sleeping monster? Leave it in the comments. Sometimes the answers say more about us than about the ice itself. At 72 degrees Celsius, the body doesn't die in a single blow. It comes apart slowly, as if each part decided to surrender on its own. First, the fingers lose their will, then the hands forget they exist, and finally the mind, exhausted and confused, begins to interpret the cold as a kind of warm welcome. The Vikings knew that deadly trick and called it the white sleep, a state in which someone losing the battle against winter smiles for no reason, pulls back their hood, opens their clothing, and feels, for one terrible instant, that the ice is embracing them. Inside the longhouse, no one allows another to fall into that sweet, lethal temptation. Movement is law, Vigilance is a pact, and life is a collective effort. If someone stops shivering, they force them to stand, to strike their arms against their chest, to stomp hard on the damp straw covering the floor. When the fire drops, they place hot stones under the hides wrapped around their feet, letting the heat travel slowly like a promise rising from the earth to remind the body it can still endure. And if a flame dies, another family gives theirs. Because in the north, fire isn't shared, it's inherited. Split lips, cracked skin, eyes, burning as if the air were ash. No one complains, because here pain isn't an enemy, it's the sign you're still present. In the end, the Vikings learn that an isolated body breaks, but a body accompanied learns to deceive the winter. Even when death whispers so close it feels like it's breathing through your skin, when the body grows used to pain and the cold stops surprising you, the last frontier remains the one no weapon can protect, the mind. In a darkness that lasts for weeks, where the sun is only a borrowed memory and silence falls over the village like a heavy cloak, the Vikings don't ask for warmth, they ask for meaning. Each night, when the wind pauses just long enough to let fear breathe, the clan gathers around the fire and turns the flame into an invisible bridge towards something larger than themselves. They tell stories not out of devotion, but to keep from disappearing inside their own thoughts, because they knew a man left silent too long could break on the inside the same way a frozen branch snaps. They believed the gods walked within the storms, that thunder was Thor's hand striking a mountain, and that the whisper of the wind carried the voices of their dead not to frighten them, but to accompany them. In nearby barrows, they found melted fat on stones, small offerings that kept alive the idea that no one was ever completely alone. That faith was a technique, a way to organize fear, to give it shape before it turned into an endless void. And while everything outside remained frozen, something like hope was born inside the fire, not for the gods, but for the mind itself refusing to surrender. When the storm withdraws and the ice needles stop striking the walls, no one celebrates. What arrives then is a silence so dense, it feels like it's watching you from every corner. A void that doesn't sound like calm, but like a still, patient, almost human presence. The Vikings feared that silence more than the snowstormer itself, because noise warns you, but the total absence of sound is as if death were staring at you without blinking. Outside, the landscape has turned into a white sculpture without a horizon. The sea is a motionless plain. The trees look like corpses covered in crystal, and the turf houses blend so deeply with the earth, they resemble freshly opened graves. Walking across that terrain is like stepping into a realm that doesn't want you there. Inside the houses, any tiny sound, a piece of wood falling, a drop melting amplifies as if the entire world were listening. And this is where the real danger appears, because prolonged silence destroys the sense of time, fractures memory, and scrambles thought. Archaeology confirms it. In several northern settlements, undecorated skin drums were found, used not for rituals, but to keep the mind from dissolving into absolute stillness, sharp strikes against the void to remind themselves they were alive. And now I'll ask you, something that unsettles even those who don't fear the cold. Do you think you could withstand 10 minutes without a single sound? The Vikings endured 40 days. Sometimes it's not winter that breaks you, but the version of yourself that appears when nothing around you makes a sound. There's a moment, barely a flash, when even the most brutal winter seems to hesitate. It happens when the 40-day darkness begins to fracture, and a golden line, almost shy, cuts across the frozen horizon as if someone had opened a slit in the sky. The Vikings step outside in silence, not because the sun intimidates them, but because after so long without light, any brightness hurts like a truth that's too honest. The men squint. The women raise their hands to receive warmth that hasn't arrived yet, and the children laugh without understanding they're witnessing a resurrection. The ice cracks, with a deep sound, a sigh rising from the bottom of the earth, and suddenly the sea, after weeks as a white corpse, splits open and reveals its black, liquid, living skin again. The smoke-darkened turf houses glimmer under the light as if they'd survived a war. The beams steam, the shadows dissolve. And in that instant, the whole village understands something no god ever explained. They didn't defeat winter through strength, but through unity. Every scar they carry is a lesson, every loss a warning. Because the cold wasn't an enemy, it was a teacher that showed them the strongest. Warmth doesn't come from fire, but from coordination, vigilance, and shared will. That night they light a bonfire outside the longhouse. Not to warm themselves, but to bid winter farewell with respect. The way you honor a worthy rival. The smoke rises clean, and the sky, for the first time in Ludingfrun, months, seems to listen. And since you've walked with them to this point, tell me in the comments what lesson you think this journey leaves us. And if you want to keep exploring more of the North's deeper stories, subscribe. There are still secrets waiting to be uncovered.